We're not out there fighting anything other than crime.
We see stuff that nobody should have to
Put
see.
your hands back! Hands back! Hands back! Go!
Get out of it, man. Get out of it! Get out of it!
Don't move! Don't move!
Okay. George 31, erect out.
Don't go!
Put it in paper. You're going to jail. Where else do you think you're going?
You're listening to The Beat, Profiles of Police Nationwide. Cops is such a great show. I mean, it brings back all those little clips you saw in the introduction are from various episodes of Cops, primarily from the 90s over the years, because I would see the reruns at Grandma's house. And what's great now is on YouTube, you can go back in time and watch some of the older episodes, and it's dramatically different. Some of the things that they were doing in the mid-90s, early 2000s, especially the mid-90s, they would not be able to do today, which is sad, but you know, it's a different story for a different day, especially that pursuit where the van crashes. That's one of my favorite chases in the entire series. I think they filmed that in Dallas, and I'm trying to get that guy that was in the chase on the show. If I could find him, his name's Dave Moran. But welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to episode 325 of the Mike DeNuevo podcast. It's volume 13 of The Beat, Profiles of Police Nationwide. Previous episode was also The Beat. That was volume 12 with retired customs agents Alex Alonso and Miles Sun, who made their returns to the podcast. Both had been on years ago, well before The Beat even started, so they were kind of precursors to it. And they came back to talk about Operation Overlord, which was a drug smuggling ring they broke up through great undercover work that stretched from Miami to Bogota. So it's literally an episode of Miami Vice, but in real life. And those two guys were living the Miami Vice life during the 80s and 90s, during the height of the Cocaine Cowboys era. Hello to everyone that's tuning in tonight. And before I forget, I'll play the ads in a moment, and then we'll get to our guest, who I don't want to keep waiting too long, because I forgot to do this the previous show. On a happier note, and then I'll get to something a little bit more serious momentarily. I want to give a shout out to two people one of which I did work with, one of which I will be working with. And one of them is Pete Lannis. Now, Pete Lannis is firefighter paramedic, or was a firefighter paramedic over in the West Haven Fire Department where I work. And he recently made the jump. He went from West Haven, Connecticut, where he worked for the last few years, and he recently moved on to the Norwalk, Connecticut Fire Department. I just want to give a shout out to my man. It was great working with him and seeing him on the B shift, the gentleman. And he definitely served the West Haven Fire Department, which I am proud to represent with this mug, which you can see here, as I have every podcast, with dignity and class. And I know he'll do the same thing in Norwalk. So, Pete, if you're listening, brother, much love to you, and all the best in this new chapter in your career. A special congratulations is also in order to Derek Torres, who graduated today from the Fire Academy, recruit class 73 here in Connecticut. He'll be joining our ranks beginning Monday or Tuesday, I believe. And much love and respect to you, Derek. And in the chances I've had to interact with you, I see you got the right stuff for this job. So I know you'll make a great fireman and a great asset to our department as well. The other thing I wanted to say is, and this goes out, and I'll explain why I'm saying this momentarily, is I'm Mike Colón, and not today. Now, why did I say that? Not today is something that Kevin Donaldson of the Suffering podcast wanted us to put together. And not today is saying not today to death, specifically suicide. As I mentioned a few episodes ago, we lost Mike Fraass. Mike Fraass was a retired Lindenhurst, New Jersey police lieutenant. He was involved in a critical incident on the job, an on-the-job shooting in which a carjacked vehicle was attempting to run him over, and he did his job and unfortunately had to take that person's life. And naturally, even if it's justified, which that certainly was, Mike suffered critically from post-traumatic stress disorder for years. He battled it, and recently he lost that battle and committed suicide. So we don't know where the trauma stems from in most people's cases. You can point to an incident like that, but there's a lot of people that aren't even involved in the military, fire department, police department, EMS, whatever kind of line of work in which you're seeing some pretty terrible things. You don't have to be involved in those fields to have some sort of PTSD. There's a lot of people who've been through some critical things in their life that unfortunately causes that. But we have to say not today, and we have to continue to fight through to that brighter day, because if we don't, we stand to lose more people like Mike, and we have to be there so that choices like the one Mike made aren't made. And, you know, Mike was a good man. Mike is somebody who definitely will be missed, but not today. We have to make sure we say not today to suicide. And as I've said before, if you are feeling that way, if there's any kind of trouble at all, my messages are always wide open. Come on in and let's talk. We've all been there, and we can all help each other through. So on that note, we'll go into our ads real quick, and then we'll get to our guest. And the first one is MC Media Editing Services. Need advice on how to start your podcast? Frustrated with the editing process? Can't find a voiceover guy? Hi, I'm Mike Colón, and I'm here to help. I'm the owner and founder of MC Media Editing Services, your premier consulting company for all things media, where I can offer you consulting advice on how to get started, and once you get started, editing, as well as voiceover work, all for a very reasonable price. If you want to reach me, you can contact me at 917-781-6189 or the email that you see listed here. I'm always available, and I'm always willing to help. Again, 917-781-6189. Why go to some giant consulting firm that's going to charge you an arm and a leg when you can just come to me? If you want to be stress-free, the way to go is to call MC. MC Media Editing Services, your premier consulting company. And a word from Billy Ryan, one of my favorite PIs. The Mike the New Haven podcast is proudly sponsored and supported by the Ryan Investigative Group. If you need an elite PI, look no further than the elite Ryan Investigative Group, which is run by retired NYPD detective Bill Ryan, a 20-year veteran of the department who served the majority of his career in the Detective Bureau, most notably in the Arson and Explosion Squad. So if you need a PI to handle anything from fraud, legal services, and anything else that you might require, contact Bill at 347-417-1610. Again, 347-417-1610. Reach him at his website or the email that you see here. Again, if you need a PI, look no further than Bill Ryan and the Ryan Investigative Group, a proud supporter and sponsor of the Mike to New Haven podcast. We may have been experiencing some audio difficulties, so if you notice that, the Wi-Fi is not that strong here in this area because it's been really, really hot today. So if that was happening on your end and not just mine, then I apologize. If it wasn't happening on your end, then I'm just crazy, and I'm just going to have to deal with that for the next 90 minutes at least, but we'll get through it. My next guest had a varied and interesting run, to say the least, out in the left coast in California, Sausalito to be specific. There's more to California than just Los Angeles, as we'll talk about tonight. He started out as a police officer, as they all do naturally. That was in 1996. And of course, that continued all the way up until his retirement in 2023 at the rank of captain. But he's still active. He's one of those guys that he hasn't retired and gone away. Not that there's anything wrong with kicking your feet up and relaxing. They've definitely earned that right after a long career, but he's still active in the consulting realm. We share a mutual friend, and that's how I got to know him. That's Steve Espinoza, who's previously been on for my NYPD Emergency Service Unit miniseries. And tonight I have, of course, someone I met through him, and that for this volume 13 of The Beat is retired Sausalito, California Police Captain Bill Fraass. Is it pronounced Fraas or Frass?
Fraass. Just imagine saying frost without the T.
Ah, okay. I should have asked you prior to the show, so you could dock me 5 points for that. So that's
Don't
okay.
worry. I've heard every kind of pronunciation of that name throughout my entire career and through my life. So all good.
All right. So volume 13 with Captain Bill Fraass. And I'll ask you, actually, before we even get into anything, where does a last name like that originate from? Is that German? What is that?
That is German, yes.
Ah, okay. Interesting. So I guess in that note, we'll get into your childhood before your career. Did you, first of all, besides where you grew up, which I know you'll get into momentarily, did you have any inklings early on that you wanted to be in civil service? Some guys, of a certain age watched Emergency or Hill Street Blues. Other guys, they had family on the job. What was your path and what was your childhood like early on?
Well, it's a combination of both. I did have family on the job. My dad's a retired police chief. My uncle was a retired police sergeant. And I grew up listening to their stories. Some of the earliest memories I ever have were listening and hearing my dad's police scanner in the background because he always wanted to know what's going on. And he's been retired for 29 years and he still listens to that thing to this day. You can't get out of the blood. Also, I loved the TV shows, Hill Street Blues, the reruns of Emergency, the reruns of Adam 12. All those shows just struck a chord in me. And also where I grew up was a large number of San Francisco PD officers, San Francisco fire officers, and just a large number of cops overall. So I kind of picked up the love of the job. And while I always kind of leaned towards that, I never really realized I really wanted to be a cop until probably after high school.
So since you mentioned it, I imagine Sausalito is fairly close then to San Fran.
We're right across the Golden Gate Bridge, where I like to say we're border patrol for San Francisco. It's basically we're the last city of sanity before you go over into the San Francisco side.
Yeah, that makes sense. I can see that being the case. So coming on in the mid 90s, I mean, well, listen, there's different pathways for you. Did you work other jobs prior to law enforcement?
Actually, I started as a reserve officer when I was 19 years old. So I basically got out of high school, went to community college for a year and a half, decided you know what, I want to be a cop, and went right in and went to the police academy, got a reserve officer gig, did that for a while, went to the academy again, and became a sworn officer. Only other really job I had was as a golf course marshal. So I was a golf cop for about a year. Um, so no, basically from my entire career was police work, and I loved almost every single moment of it.
Naturally. And now that's something I wanted to touch on with you because you don't see that in the Northeast too much. There are auxiliary programs. For example, the NYPD does have the auxiliary officer program. But as far as reserve officers, you see that more out towards Florida, at least that part of the East Coast, and more out west as well. So for those not familiar, what can a reserve officer do and not do? And what was the process like to go through the training?
Basically, a reserve police officer is a peace officer while on duty and has the legal authorities while on duty. However, when you're off duty, in most cases, you don't have peace officer powers. And in some departments, you get paid, other departments, you don't get paid. In California, we had 3 levels. It was a level 1, which was basically you had every kind of duty that an officer can do. You were just not usually, most cases, non-paid, and you weren't full-time. A level 2 was basically you were there when you were on duty at peace officer powers. You were there to be able to help out. You could conduct some investigations, and you were able to work on your own. And then there were level 3 reserves, which was you had peace officer powers while you were on duty, but you always had to be a partner with somebody. And there were different at the time, there were different training levels that you had to require. California has all changed that right now. And basically, if you wish to be a reserve, you have to have the same training as if you were a fully sworn officer. But as those changes happened, things have changed. Due to my age, I was a level 3 officer. I was 19 years old. Who gives a gun to a 19-year-old? But I was at the right place, at the right time, and I learned a lot. And that allowed me to segue easier to the police full-time job. But as laws changed, training mandates changed, you stopped seeing departments hiring reserves because you have to train them exactly the same. You have to make sure they have the same amount of academy work. They have to work so many hours per month. It became more and more difficult to maintain them. In California, we used to have a huge reserve presence, and probably from the 1920s until about the 1980s. Then all those changes happened, and then numbers have dwindled dramatically.
Well, you're seeing that, I think, across the country now on both sides. It's interesting for me where I work currently, and of course, doing this podcast talking to both sides, where on the fire side and on the police side, volunteerism for the reserve officers and for volunteer fire companies is down across the board. And it's hard. And there's a combination of reasons as to why. Some of it is people just don't have the time to commit. Some of it is also people feel like the schooling is a lot. But I mean, back then, or as you would say now, with the level of training required, you might as well just join the full-time force and career force. There's really no sense in being a reserve. And that's probably one of the reasons why it's down in California.
Exactly. It's people are looking at it, and by the time people are saying, I have to do all this training, I don't have time to go to the academy during the nighttime and do my regular job during the day. And if I'm going to do all this, why don't I just go full-time? Also, liability issues have come up over the years in which, hey, you know what, this person missed a few shifts, this person wasn't fully trained, or missed a couple trainings, something happened, a use of force occurred, agencies were paying off huge amounts of money. So that's why things started getting settled down. And just also, as you've seen, I mean, probably since the big events of the 1990s, the Rodney Kings, the O.J. Simpson case, police work started getting a bad name in some areas, and that stopped people from volunteering.
Right. No, and you know what? And we can dive into that because that segues into your entry into the full-time force in 1996. But last note on your time as a reserve, and we're talking with Bill Fraass here for Volume 13 of the Beat Profiles of Police Nationwide. If you have a question, fire away in the super chat, and I'll get to it. Is you mentioned it was an easier segue. It's difficult to work the street at any age as a rookie because naturally bad guys are looking to test you. And I go back to the old episodes of Cops, particularly the ones they filmed in California, watching a sergeant like Dale LaFleur worked the street was amazing, because here's a guy with 25 years in the job. He knew how to work people. And I don't mean that as a knock on him. No, it's a compliment. He knew how to deal with people. He didn't take any crap from anybody, and he commanded that respect. So guys knew, well, that's Dale. We're not going to mess with him. A new jack, if you will, especially a teenage one at that, people think it's open season. So for a 19-year-old that's trying to find their way in the world to begin with, it's not an easy line to walk. But now you add the police aspect to it, and it becomes 10 times harder. What helped you walk that line between I'm a public servant, but I'm not a pushover either?
I think also growing up in a family of cops taught me to be able to be vocal and be able to stand up for myself. My family were cops, construction workers, or former military. So you had to be able to stand up for yourself, and you had to be able to put your opinion out there and back your opinion up. If not, you're going to be shouted down. You were going to be shown that, hey, you know what, if you can't hold your own, we're going to just bypass you. Also, I was an athlete growing up, and being an athlete, it lets you interact with all kinds of people on your own team, on other teams, and it allows you to learn how to communicate and take charge, and also to get along. So all those things helped me. Also, being somebody who was studious of human nature. Even as a child, I would watch people all the time, and I would watch them and kind of pick up on their traits. And as a little one, I would kind of mimic them, not knowing what else to do. But I would pick up on these things and learn from them. So when I was approaching people at those young ages of 19, 20, 21, I was trying to make sure that my behaviors, my words matched those of somebody who was older. And also, I tried to speak like I was somebody older. Also, I grew a goatee, and I had a goatee throughout my entire reserve time. I had to shave it for a short period of time at the academy, and I grew it back. It made me just look older. And all these years, I still have it. So those things, and just being somebody who was aware what was going on in the world, because you had to know, hey, times are tough now. People are losing their jobs. People are upset about an election, or people are upset about this movement. Know who to contact, how to contact them, how to speak to them, and not I like to say, getting my education later in life allowed me to be better as an officer, because I learned how to deal with people in the real world. And I wasn't sheltered by, you know what, I went to school and I studied basket weaving 101, and I went to parties and I did this. No, the parties I was going to I was breaking them up. So it's all those little things that helped me adjust and deal with older people, especially when you're 19, 20, 21, and you're telling a 40-year-old, hey, you're going to jail, or you're telling a 50-year-old, you can't beat your wife, you're going to jail for hitting your wife. It just took a lot of quickly growing up, and also being able to working and trying to develop my communication skills as much as possible.
And I think that is a good look at it, because I mean, again, it's, as I mentioned earlier, it's critical at any stage in life. When you're 19, even without the ambitions you had, you're trying to find yourself. But to be involved around, and again, this was kind of my case as a kid, adults, mature adults, good influences early on, you mimic that, you pick that up, and you grow up a little bit quicker as a result. But it's character building. It's not bad. As long as you're around positive influences, which we both were, we had the good fortune of, it's going to only help you as you get older, because as a result, you not only look older in appearance, perhaps, but you also look older in how you carry yourself, which is not something, as you see what's going on in society these days, that kids who are your age or are your age that you were when you're starting your police career right now, they don't have that. We see where they're ending up.
No, I had good friends that ended up going to state prison because they made mistakes. Right. I had friends that had hard times because they behaved ways they shouldn't have, especially when they were in those, you're not a kid anymore, but you're not really an adult. But if you make a mistake, there's true punishments. They made bad calls. They got involved with the wrong people. I was lucky. I was able to get along with a lot of people, but I never hung out with individuals that could get me in trouble. And also, because of the background I had and the people I had in my life, I knew that if I were to stray, it would not last that long, because somebody would be coming and grabbing me. I was learning life lessons from an uncle who saw combat in World War II in the Pacific. I was learning life lessons from my father, who started out as an 18-year-old officer in 1963, who, when the Watts riots occurred, he went down to Southern California and participated in the response to the Watts riots. So I was learning life lessons from so many different people, and not even cops. I mean, my mother, her parents came from Russia, immigrants as young children, and they came with nothing. And they worked on establishing a family, establishing a life, raising children and raising them. And my grandfather built half of San Francisco. Those lessons were inputted to my mother, who passed them on to me, which allowed me to look at things and go, you know what, life is hard, but the decisions I make will make it either easier or harder. So let's make the right decisions.
Right. And it's those guiding principles that build strong character. And as a result, for anybody entering the workforce, no matter what the career of choice is, make for strong employees. And that was something that I felt your generation had. It was one of the final generations that had it, because although there are some in this generation that do possess it, and I mentioned a couple at the top, my man Pete, and I know Derek will do the same thing, and along with a lot of other people I'm fortunate to work with who are in the same age bracket as I am, we see a lot that don't. And I wish that principle was still in effect as it was to a greater degree back then, because with that, I think you would see a lot more positive contributions to not only the workforce, but society as a whole. And speaking of society, policing in 1996 was in a unique spot countrywide. Los Angeles, in particular in California, was not having the best time of things. There was the riots following Rodney King. There was Watts Part 2. Then you had the Rampart scandal, which was right around the corner in 1997. And then there was, of course, the O.J. Simpson debacle in 1994. But while that's going on in L.A., there is the rest of California, and there's the rest of the country. And you're experiencing the magnum opus of the crime decline. Policing is, dare I say, in its glory stages in most places. So for Sausalito in 1996, where was it policing wise? And for those not familiar with it, most of my audience are New Yorkers after all, what's the population that we're talking here? And what were some of the common crimes, if you will, back then?
Well, it was funny. So Sausalito is a city of approximately, depending on what time of year you grab, about 7,500 to 8,000 residents. However, because of our location to San Francisco, on the weekends, we could have 50 to 60,000 people coming through at any time. And because of our locations, we had high crimes for many years. At one time, our crime rate was, I want to say, right behind Richmond's for the Bay Area for auto burglaries, thefts. We even had a lot of robberies. As economies got better and things got better, those started dwindling down. But when I first started, we were still seeing a lot of burglaries. We were still seeing a lot of fights. Our demographics were changing. We were going from a very well-to-do live and let live lifestyle, which at one time we had, in a town of 2.2 square miles, we had 22 bars. And we had a strong waterfront presence. We also had a counterculture presence, and we had a lot of issues. That was beginning to die down, but we were seeing a lot of traffic issues. We were seeing a lot of fights, domestic violence. Narcotics was still a lot of powdered cocaine. And we have San Francisco on one side, and that bridge doesn't stop anything. So you are still having hardcore gang members coming across San Francisco and we still do to this day, to steal cars, to victimize people in every which way you can. So we started turning the tide on crime in the probably mid 1980s, and our numbers kept going down and down and down. But by the time I came down, we were still a very proactive police department. We were stopping people left and right, contacting suspicious people. We were expected to go out there, do the job, and be proactive, and not to sit all day watching YouTube. Or they wanted us to be seen doing things. It wasn't, hey, you know what? We're not going to stop cars because it's bad optics. The 90s were a generation of cops that wanted to go out there and make a difference. And a lot of times, even when you had what was going down in Southern California, you heard hatred of police, but they didn't aim it towards, they aimed it towards the department where that problems were occurring. They weren't aiming it at a Joe Q officer. That mentality has changed. Now, if something happens in Tallahassee, some cop in Alaska is getting blamed for it. Back then, it wasn't. People figured it out. And San Francisco was never a very pro police. I mean, since the 1960s, it was never pro police. But we never had too much of that blend coming over and influencing us too much, which was good. But I mean, we were dealing with a lot and we were very busy. I mean, I remember before I left, our reports had gone down dramatically. Our crimes had gone dramatically. And I remember telling officers, like case numbers, they were going, oh, we took 60 cases this month. I said, we used to take 130 to 140 on a slow month. And it was like, huh? And it was like, it was a different time, but we were generating 70% of that self-initiated. So that, I mean, I like to say there was a generation of cops that started coming into the job in the late 60s and early 70s that were hitting their peak in the 80s and 90s. And throughout the country, we were fighting crimes proactively and beating crime down and keeping the criminals from hurting the communities too much. Things have changed because attitudes have changed, and some philosophies that are now prevalent in police work are encouraging lazy policing and not proactive policing.
And I guess we can, and I don't mean to jump ahead, but it's warranted here. I feel like this generation now, and it's not necessarily their fault. We're not going to get political here. It's not the nature of the show, but just we're looking at it strictly from a tactical and operational standpoint. It's not a complacent generation by choice of police officer. I think it's more so a confused one where they want to do the work, but the consequences for them doing their work and sometimes the directives they're receiving, which indicate one thing but may mean another depending on the climate from the upper echelon of their given departments, leads them to be disenchanted a heck of a lot quicker than you ever saw. Cops in the past would roll over into different departments or different professions altogether. Back then, it's not like that wasn't happening, but you're seeing it now to a large degree for a variety of reasons, but mainly there seems to be a lack of streamlined style of policing to where, okay, here's our standard of operations. We need you to do this. And as you go along, mix this in if you can as well. But the primary focus is this. Now it's almost like an abstract painting. You don't know which way it's going. And a young officer, which is already under a lot of pressure as it is, faces even more stress now. And that, I think, kills any incentive to want to do the job the way it's supposed to be done.
Exactly. And it's not the officer's fault. It's not the cop's fault. What happened is it's been pushed by the politicians like crazy. Doesn't matter what party you are, you've played a role in it one time or the other. And it also has encouraged a generation that they're afraid of what's going to happen. If I use force, am I going to go to jail? Because all these laws have been changed for certain reasons that are some justified, others completely unjustified. The majority laws have changed for based on lies, based on false narratives. And officers are afraid, if I have to use force, if I arrest somebody, am I going to end up being sued? Am I going to lose my job? Back then, it was handle the job and you deal with what comes with it. As a cop, you're going to get sued. But now the chances of being sued are so often. Now, if I used force on somebody and a lawyer claims, hey, it was excessive or it was too much, even though it wasn't, now officers are afraid. Are they going to get thrown to the wolves by a police chief or a sheriff that will not back them for political repercussions? Is the mayor, is the city manager going to go, I'm going to appease a certain citizenry group or all the citizenry group and not back my officer? What are they facing? I mean, officers used to go out there with a fire in their belly because they knew they had the backing. Even if they didn't like their police chief or their sheriff, they knew that that person came up through the ranks and typically was a career cop and usually had 15, 20, 30 years in time before you started making those positions. Then there came a generation of risk avoidance by young cops that became young supervisors and ended up being rushed into command, either to meet metrics or because they were students or they went to college, and they brought a different style of policing that was not as assertive. Cops to be effective, a cop has to be assertive. Aggressive, you could go too far, but assertive, that means you're out there doing the job the way it's supposed to be done, and you're going to make sure you do it right. you started having leaders get into law enforcement that were more academics than true police. You started having people trying to bring agendas into policing. They were trying to change culture and change philosophies that was going through mainstream society by making police do things that are different. It's kind of like the saying goes, armies should not nation build. That's not what an army is there for. Police are here to protect, to serve, and to safeguard. We're not here to change philosophies. We're not here to push social agendas. We're not here to do any of that either of the political parties at one time or the other wanted to be done through law enforcement. And that's where we lost our way as a profession. And many people in leadership lost their way to went from my focus are the officers and making sure we do the right thing for the community we serve to if something goes wrong, am I going to get fired?
And I think it's well said, because here's another drawback I feel. And in addition to everything that you just said, two things. One, it became too much of a numbers game as well. And two, and I'll touch on actually the second detail first before I get into the numbers aspect. The public is smart. The public is not stupid. You have members of the public that act stupid, but the overall public is not stupid. They know when a police department, kind of like a fighter that's under siege. We see it in boxing. We see it in UFC. When they're under siege, what do? They cover up. They turtle up because they're trying to stop the blows and make sure the ref doesn't stop the fight. When the public can even so much as start to feel that a police department is doing that, that's where the tide turns, because you have supervisors, like you just said, oh, no, we're not going to do that. And I'll give an example. New York City. And it's not every single officer in the NYPD's fault that this occurred, but in the 70s and 80s, because of the corruption that Serpico unearthed, there was an averseness to doing narcotics bust because of fear of potential repercussions of officers taking bad actions. Now you're telling your officers, because of these knuckleheads and what they did, I don't trust you. So if they can't do it, then nobody can. So that's one collective frustration. And it wasn't really until Bratton got in there in the early 90s and said, no, let's be the police and do that police thing where, oh, yeah, you're not going to sell drugs because that's bad and destroys the community, where cops were allowed to be cops again. And I'm putting it in simple terms, but really that's what was happening across the board in so many different places, where not only was there a diverseness, but there was, whether they meant to portray it this way or not, a lack of trust of the officers coming in. So wherever job you're starting, but especially a job as critical as that one, and policing is critical and integral to society. If you're telling me off the rip that you don't trust me in my judgment, despite the fact that you yourself provided me with the so-called training to go out there and execute, why would I want to work for you? Why would I want to do the job? What's the incentive?
Exactly. Is when you're not allowing cops to do cop work and you're not giving them the trust to go out there and do it the best way they think they can, you're depriving them of opportunities to enjoy their job, to take full fulfillment of their job, and try to do their job as best as possible. Exactly. And one of the problems I have seen is we have been so afraid of, we're going to get sued, we're going to look bad, is there going to be a corruption, don't do anything. Well, then if you start telling cops or tell anybody not to do anything, they're going to push that. Well, if I don't have to do this, well, maybe I don't have to do this. Maybe I don't have to do this. And you create an atmosphere of do nothings. And we can't have that. I mean, I remember when I was working on my master's thesis many years ago, I had the great opportunity of talking with Commissioner Bratton about his philosophies. He had in Boston, he had in New York both times, and also in LA. And he said, you had to stir things up and you had to make changes. Hey, the warrant squad, you're only working 8 to 5 and you're not working on weekends. Well, you know what? People that have warrants are home after hours and on weekends. Start going in there and checking things. You know what? We're going to start deploying different tactics. We're going to start actually pushing people out there and expecting you to actually work. That's what things need to be done. And when you start having people say, don't do anything because look what's on TV, look what's going on. And that's social media has done a lot of wonderful stuff. But I saw a sheriff from, I believe, somewhere in Florida made a comment the other day. The worst thing that probably has ever happened and is pure evil is social media. Mm-hmm. And in some ways it is, because one story now goes across the world. And if a lie will completely travel across social media, across the world 50 times before the truth is even heard. So what happens is a cop who's getting ready to go to work sees this, hey, this officer's being charged, this officer's being complained about, this is what's going on, and they're hearing about it nonstop. So they get to work going, well, you know what? I'm a young husband. I'm a young wife. I got a family at home. I just bought a house. If I go out there and I do something wrong, am I going to lose it all? So why risk it all? And then when you don't have your studies have still shown the public trusts the police. However, we don't hear about it as much because mainstream media and activists, social media groups push out the people hate the cops. Here's stories about horrible cops. So they start going, well, if the community doesn't want us to do anything, why should we do anything? And you start ignoring segments of the community that goes, hey, we want you to do stuff. We want you guys to be out here. And I hate to say, whenever we have huge amounts of police mistrust and animosity towards the police, the communities that suffer the largest are the lower socioeconomic communities, the communities that have the highest crime rates, because what happens, specialty units get pulled out. Cops are told, don't go be aggressive, don't make traffic stops, don't watch the optics. So the people that prey on the communities start preying harder. And then we find ourselves in a hole that is even almost impossible to dig out of.
Yeah, I mean, and the unfortunate thing is most people aren't even on social media, so they don't care about what's being said up there. They're living it day to day. And I've said this before, living in a city as interesting as New Haven, Connecticut, we have over 100,000 people in this city. So there's a lot that goes on. And like with every big city, you have your nice areas, you have your nice, not so nice areas. My street is particularly nice and peaceful and quiet. A couple blocks over from me is the projects. So it's not uncommon to hear gunshots at night. And I've said before, it's not me being Hispanic. It's not a race thing. I don't care what you are. If you're endangering my community and making my life very uncomfortable because you're dealing drugs, you're robbing people, you're carrying a gun, or doing all three of those things, I don't care if you're purple or Marvin the Martian himself. I want you in jail. I want you off the street. And most people feel that way. They want proactive policing. And we'll get back to your career in a second, but I did want to touch on this too. I mentioned numbers game earlier, and this is the part that's disconcerting. CompStat is a great tool. CompStat should never go away. And I think what Jack Maple and Bill Bratton started during their days together in the New York City Transit Police is one of the most ingenious inventions that policing has or will ever see. In its purest form, and key emphasis on that, it's a great way to track accountability, track trends, and track for ways in which if there is a crime spike, okay, Commander, what is your plan if in that specific zone to drive it down? And you come up with initiatives and crime drops down. And when it continues to go down, it becomes a hallmark of who's doing the best job in each command zone or in each precinct, depending on what city you're talking about. Now it's being used in a more punitive measure. So where you have commanders under undue stress, they see a crime spike, they feel they don't have enough resources to do it. They can't trust their upper echelon that they report to help them come up with initiatives to drive it down. And who bears the weight of that stress and who bears the weight of the initiative to drop it down? Now it's the patrol officers. Under enough stress as it is, now dealing with the supervisor, that it's not their fault either, I should say, but they're under so much flack from the public and the brass as to why the numbers are up, that now all of a sudden they're getting a little bit more irascible, a little bit more irritable. And that really not only spreads down to one individual officer, but an entire platoon and can drive down morale.
I agree. The thing is, we have to realize statistics are what comes when you're doing the job right. Statistics should never drive how you do the job. Not everybody deserves a ticket. Not everybody deserves to be arrested. There are certain crimes, domestic violence, assaults, vicious attacks, sexual assaults, things like that. Yeah, you go to jail, you don't pass go, you don't collect 200 or any of that stuff. But there are certain things like, hey, this person has a warrant for failure to pay child support and it was a mistake. You know what? We can give the guy a break for a second. Or the girl, she was driving under the influence. There wasn't anybody on the street for miles around and she drove literally 100 feet. She didn't crash into anything. You know what? We could put her in a car, send her home. And if it ever happens again, you know what? We'll deal with it. But there's certain things you can't drive police work by saying, hey, I wrote 50 tickets today and I arrested 20 people. I must be the greatest cop. We're doing a great job. No, because there are a time in which you could there's only so many tickets that could go around. There's only so many arrests that could go around. So if you're stopping the same person 14 times as they transfer through one beat, well, that's going to be an issue, especially when they've done nothing wrong because you were doing a suspicious person contact, or you got to be aware of what is happening and doing the best job. And it was taking action for the safety of the public and doing things for the good of the public. And it's not to see who gets the most tickets. It's not to see who gets the officer of the month because they made the most arrests or because they did the most foot patrols or they spent the most hours shaking door handles and talking to community members downtown. It's well-roundedness. It's addressing the issues that you're facing. It's knowing your community and knowing what the problems are. And once you start allowing statistics to push what your departments do, you lose respect from the community because they're going, hey, these people, my department for years had a horrible reputation as being a speed trap. You drive through Sausalito 1 mile per hour over the limit, you're going to get a ticket. I can tell you, I worked there for many years. My family had worked there since 1965. At no time in my department's history did anybody ever give a ticket for 1 mile per hour over the limit. When you started looking, in most cases, most people were given about 13 to 15 miles per hour before they started getting tickets. You might get stopped and told to slow down. To this day, God, almost 60 years from the first time a member of my family worked at my department, that rumor is still going on that we'll stop people for a mile over. And you go, where did this come from? Well, it was because they saw a lot of numbers, but they also saw a lot of stops, and you had people pushing that false narrative. And then also you had people saying, you know I see all these things must be going on. I always like to say about statistics and numbers, Mark Twain said it best. There are lies, there's damn lies, and then there's statistics. And this number still goes. So we got to be aware of what the issues are in our community. We have to police proactively, but understandingly, and we have to be assertive, and we got to know when to take action and when the best course of business is not a summons. It's not a CS arrest, which the DA is not going to kick because you barely had anything. It's dealing with the problem. And we a lot of times have dealt with problems by throwing numbers at it instead of going, what's the core root of this problem? So that's what we have to be aware of, and we have to teach our officers. Be smart policing. Don't be just a numbers generator, and don't take a chainsaw to solve a problem that a scalpel is most necessary for.
And that's a good way to look at it. It's a policy and a really just a philosophy overall, not even a policy, that would be well served to be implemented in police departments across the country. And some departments are already doing that. Other departments would do well to take note. Back to your career now, because you did have an interesting one. And we've been talking so much about tactics and operations, which I've enjoyed, that I feel bad because we've almost glossed over it to this point. But prior to you ascending in the ranks, those early years on patrol, what sticks? I mean, granted, you had the advantage of having been a reserve officer prior, but on the paid side of things, or on the full-time side of things, I should say, what are some of the early moments that stick out from patrol that made you say, okay, I feel like I'm gaining a good feel for this job, and I feel like I made a positive impact and difference in someone's life today?
Some of them were the cases I worked in which I would interact with the family members, missing juvenile cases. And the parents would come back later and say, hey, thank you for everything you did to help us find them. They're having issues, but now we're able to get some help. That meant a ton to me. It was sergeants that had years of seniority, not only in my department, but in other agencies and some much larger agencies that had come to my department, entrusting me to take on roles and responsibilities of a senior officer when they could have gone to other officers with more time. It was seeing the gratitude of the public when you actually do something that truly impacts and makes a difference in their lives. And sometimes that was arresting the bad guy. Sometimes that was helping the little old lady cross the street, because you know what, in the long run, we're there to help. One of the things that sticks out in my mind to this day was one of the first patrol shifts I ever ran I ever worked. I'm driving down the road, and probably a man in his 80s came up to me, and he had a little flyer, and he says, and he was shaken. He was upset. You could tell he had been crying, and he was saying, I had lost my cat. I hadn't seen my cat in a couple days. I don't know what happened. And he hands, will you please look for him? Well, I could tell that cat was the only thing that man had in his life. I could tell he'd had hard times because I could smell the alcohol in his breath, and it's 9 o'clock in the morning. And I could tell that that cat might be the only thing that was keeping him going. I searched day long for that cat. I was going in the parks. I walked through between houses. I even crawled into a couple big gutter vents to see if the cat had crawled and gone in there. I couldn't find this cat at all. And when I came back and I saw the guy the next day, I said, I looked everywhere I can. I'll keep on looking. And he goes, well, thank you. It means a lot because some people just don't even pay attention to me when I brought this up. It was moments like that. I mean, yeah, there was the pursuits were great. The big cases were great. It was being able to fighting somebody in the middle of the street who's high on LSD. And it takes 6 of us to get them down. And by the time me being pepper sprayed during the fight and not realizing afterwards, and it's like, oh God, that was crazy. Or, I don't know, stopping Robin Williams on his bicycle and talking to, he used to ride through town all the time, or those little things that are kind of, this is a great gig because you never know who you're going to find. But then at the same time, catching a sexual assault and having your sergeant go, we're not handing this to the detectives. You're running with it. Having a long lasting fraud case and the sergeant going, you know what, let's have you run with this. Being entrusted to run a patrol team when in the absence of a sergeant, when I was the youngest person on that team, little things kept me energized, kept me happy, kept me looking for the next challenge, and also made me realize that I kind of had a little talent for this. I was enjoying it, and I was being assertive. I was going out there, making cases, making good arrests, being proactive. So that kept me pushing for more.
And I feel like if you're in the emergency response field, it's such a good crossroads. It's the ultimate quote unquote good problem to have, if you will, to where, and I've said this before on the podcast, I've talked to enough firemen and cops to come to this conclusion. If you want to stay a police officer strictly or a firefighter strictly and never ascend to the rank of command, any kind of command in either side of the field, you can do that, and there's no problem with that. You can have so much fun. And there are guys that did that for 25, 30 years, if not more, and had an absolute blast. But there are some, and this is where it becomes a good problem, that realize, I have enough talent for this that if I wanted to be a boss, it's not something that's out of the realm of possibility. But it's in taking that step and realizing that you're 110% into taking that step that becomes the next challenge, if you will. So imagine after those confidence builders, you said to yourself, okay, full steam ahead, let's try this. And I'll go back a bit. Coming out in 1996, was that something you had in mind from the jump? I want to be a boss in this job someday.
It was kind of funny because growing up in the family I had, and as a father who was a police chief, people used to always say that, oh, you must want to be police chief. I just wanted to be a good cop and enjoy it. And then along the line, I decided I wanted to be the best I could be. And I wanted to rise to the rank that I would be, that my talents and my abilities allowed me to serve at. My goal was actually a specialty position. I was hoping one day to be a detective. And my ideal rank was to be a street sergeant, because sergeant is the greatest job in the world. And it's the most important job in any police department because they keep the day-to-day operations rolling. They're the first line of bosses on the street. They have the most impact for the people on the street. And they're the ones that make things happen. So those were my goals. And anything that flowed after that was just kind of icing on the cake, because there were good days and there were bad days. But it was, hey, you know what? Also, as I started getting older and I started looking at these opportunities, I had the benefit of working for great leaders. I had the benefit of working for horrible leaders. And I'm not going to be like these people. And I also looked around, and sometimes I made a decision and I would look and go, I may want to promote, and later on it was I will promote because I will never work for that person. And those are things that kind of kept me moving because I wanted to be a certain type of cops, and I saw other people that didn't want to be. So I thought, if things go the wrong way, I may end up working for somebody who I don't trust as a cop and I don't respect for as a cop.
Right. And then that goes back to our conversation earlier on incentive and motive to want to do the job. It's an important job, but when you don't like the person you're working for very much, it kind of kills a little bit of that incentive and it makes the job a little bit harder to do and push through. Now, getting into a position of command, if you will, what made it easier is you did not go into it cold. You had the experience of acting as a sergeant in a capacity where the actual sergeant was away. But when it becomes official, the mentality shifts completely because when you're doing it as an acting sergeant, you're doing that for one shift. Now it's real. Now it's going to be every shift. You're not only thinking about your safety and how you're going to get through the tour, but you're thinking about how your officers under you are going to do the same. And you have those officers, and again, this goes back to good problem to have. They are go, go, go. They're like that old Eagle song, Life in the Fast Lane. That's just how they live it on patrol. And that's a great thing because they're go-getters. But as a sergeant, it's a blessing and a curse all in one because you have to know when to pull them back. And they might take years off your life in the process. So for you, as a sergeant, dealing with those go-getters, tell me about that.
Oh, it was when you had those officers that wanted to move a million miles an hour, and stop everything that moved and get involved in everything. You had to yank their chain at times and say, hey, you know what? Let's think about this for a second. Let's slow down. And what do you actually have here? Because they could find you the greatest stuff or they could get you in the biggest headaches. You could also, I remember one guy, I said he works well when he's supervised by standing on his neck, because if you don't, he's going to do something that's utterly insane. Um, I rather supervise the people that were going out there trying to work the hardest and do the most they can and maybe had to be pulled back a little bit than those officers I had to kick in the butt to get any kind of activity on, or those officers that disappeared after a certain time and you never saw them again until an hour before shift change. It's hard because when you go from being worker B to the first level of boss B, people will test you. People will see what you're made of. And people will see, are you still want to be a buddy, or are you going to be the person who's going to be a boss? And it goes back to one of the greatest things that ever was told, was that sometimes when you're giving love, it has to be tough love. And it has to be, you got to give it to them straight. You can't baby step around these individuals because they're officers, they're grown-ups. Tell them how it is, treat them properly, treat them fairly and consistently. But then when I first made sergeant, my chief, who I had the greatest respect in the world for, told me it's no longer about you. It's about what you could do for other people. And that I took that as my mantra for my years in supervision and later in command, as, you know what? It's not what I care about. It's not what I like. It's about what I could do to make everybody better, try to make their job a little bit more fulfilled, give them the tools they needed, knowing that I'm not going to be able to make everybody happy. It's impossible. But treating people fairly, consistently, giving them good opportunities, and trying to let them grow and develop with a little bit of guidance. And it took time, but when I was put into that position, it was finally that's when I really felt things started clicking, where I was able to take my street cop knowledge, combine it with my ability to hopefully help these people. And those are the best years of my career.
Mm-hmm. I mean, listen, you got to gun it. You got to gun it, but you have to gun it responsibly. I go back to the fighter analogy. You got fighters that are brawlers. I grew up a mixed martial arts fan. Chuck Liddell was that way. Don Fry was that way. Ken Shamrock was that way. But it was controlled. Know when to push, know when to go full steam ahead and throw those punches, know when to stop and catch your breath before you keep going. That's the same thing in police work. There's times to go full steam ahead on a case or out on the street, but there's so much going on that if you're swinging wildly, much like a fighter, you could have all the power in the world. You'll get caught with that lucky punch. You'll get knocked out. You could make a mistake because you're moving a million miles an hour. And an officer doing that is one thing. If you got a boss that does that, that's another issue in and of itself.
All kind of problems because it just takes the problem and magnifies it a million times.
Mm-hmm.
And a good sergeant is able to guide one of those officers that are going 1,000,000 miles per hour and then let them know going 1,000,000 miles per hour is cool. Don't go 1,000,000 miles per hour into a wall. This is
Exactly.
what you got to do. Time to back off, time to go. It's, you got to take that step back and take a look at that bigger picture. Some sergeants are able to do it. Some are great at it. Some never really lose the patrol officer mindset of this is what we're doing, and they can't see the other things around them. But a good street boss is going to be the person who has the most impact on every police officer out there.
Right. There is every cop's magnum opus, if you will, which is the aha. This was my signature police moment, or I am the police moment, if you will. And you had a lot of them, but I have one right here. And this case involved the collaboration with multiple agencies, and kind of like we talked about earlier, we're not kicking this to detectives; we're letting you run it. I'm talking about the Mark Anderson wine embezzlement case that began in December of 2003. I'll share the PDF so the audience can see it. And while I do that, I'll just have you tell the story. This was quite the case.
Well, it's a very long-winded story and a lot of things that happened. But one of the things that occurred was I was a brand new detective. I had just gone into investigations about 6 months prior, and I was actually at dinner with my girlfriend, who is now my wife, who was telling me that, hey, a call came in today about somebody claiming a theft of wine. And I was like, okay, well, never heard of it. And she goes, no, it's actually like $600,000 worth of fine wine has been taken from this location. And I was like, okay, well, this is quite interesting. So I was told that on a Saturday. I came back to work on a Tuesday. I find a little file on my desk that says basically, hey, this is what we have, run with it, see what you can find out. And in reality, as the slide says right there, the case started in 2003 and didn't officially end probably till a couple of years ago after this year because of his death. All the work and stuff was over 6,600 pages. And the individual, as we see right here, Mark Anderson, was supposed to be a pillar of the community. He was somebody who was well known. He was somebody who was on different boards through the community. He ran programs for the community. And he was somebody who used to be a newspaper article, and wrote an article for a local newspaper. Turned out that he opened up a wine storage facility. And he started stealing the most expensive and the most important bottles of wine and the rarest bottles of wine from his collectors. And these collectors were very wealthy. They had very large, the bottles of wines, the cheapest bottle of wine was $17, and the most expensive bottle of wine was $29,000. A 1959 bottle of Latif Rothschild. I still remember that to this day. Well, what he ended up doing is he would look at accounts and look at different people who were storing their wines for long periods of time. And then when he saw no activity, he was started cherry picking the best wines for themselves. And he would take it, and little by little, and he would start taking huge numbers. And nobody really noticed it until one day somebody sold their wine collection to New York Christie's, and they came to pick it up. And it was like, hey, there's supposed to be 756 boxes of wine here. We only have 300. What happened? And he goes, no, I never received anything. Well, yes, you did. Your signature's right here on the receipt. Nope, never had it. So he kept on denying, saying he never received the wine. He started saying this is a lie. And he kept on going. And then more and more people started going, you know what? If it's happened to one person, let me check my wine storage. And they started discovering they started missing. So in the long run, just of my piece of the case, where he, from 13 victims, he embezzled over 8,000 bottles of wine in a total of $1.2 million, which was it's one of the largest wine thefts in the history of the U.S. And he kept on doing this and kept on doing lies about it. And when we started putting cases against him and we started getting evidence and recovering bottles he sold to different locations for cheap under false names, we started getting criminal charges put against him. And then one day, me getting ready to go to bed, me and my wife are watching the news, and we see a big fire that's headlining the news. And I'm looking at that going, I know that building. I know that building exactly. I'm going, that's Wine Central. Well, turns out my pager goes off. It's back when we had pagers. And it says, contact Vallejo Police Department immediately for an arson fire. Turns out somebody had started a fire at the facility that Mark Anderson had been storing all the wine at. And it was suspicious in nature, and Anderson was seen in the location. I remember telling the investigator at that moment, Mark Anderson is the person who lit this fire. I have no doubt in my mind. Because he was not only facing charges from us, he was facing charges from the IRS for not paying his taxes, for falsifying tax records, and numerous other, and doing business under fictitious names and everything. Well, evidence later on showed that the fire started in his area where he stored the wine, and the ATF got involved very quickly. It was the amount has never been exactly shown of how much wine was destroyed, but it was the equivalent of approximately a 6-alarm fire. It took about 2 days to finally put everything down. The fire occurred in a concrete building that used to be used by the U.S. Navy to repair submarines. And when the fire was started, the fire caused such a vacuum in that building that it took like 3 or 4 people to force open a door because the vacuum was so strong to be able to, for people to escape. It's just pure luck that nobody died. At this time, we estimated that the damage was between $200 to $400 million worth of wine that was destroyed. We worked this case as a joint investigation. It discovered other crimes he committed, such as mail fraud, for many, many years. ATF, myself, Vallejo, IRS. And he ended up being sentenced his original sentence was 26 years in federal prison. He did 16 of those before being released on compassionate leave, and he just passed away recently. But international case went all over the world because of, first, number one, it was the theft of wine and then such a large arson fire. And it was one of those things where you go from just trying to do your regular detective work every day to one next day you have the LA Times calling, the New York Times calling, you have news from different European channels calling you have different TV shows showing up. And it was like, well, what's happened here? And basically this man started just trying, he thought he was going to get away with it because he had been lying about everything his entire life and never got caught. Claimed to write songs for Iron Butterfly. They never heard of him. Claimed to have been a sumo wrestler. Never sumo wrestled in his life that anybody knew of. Claimed to be an attorney. Well, he went to law school. He never passed the bar. All these little by little lies came in, and he always thought he could outsmart everybody. So the day we put cuffs on him, I remember he was shocked. We all rolled up on him as he was backing his car out of the garage. We threw the cuffs on him, an IRS agent did. And he was just looking around going, what's going on? What's going on? And I had to look at him straight in the face. And I said, Mark, you're under arrest. And he just turned ash white because prior to his arrest, he was going around town saying, this is all falsehoods. These are all lies. He was going to the city manager. He was going to city council members saying that I was framing him. I was trying to turn this into a career case so I could get promoted. And he was making such a rigmarole about everything. So cuffing him and then telling him he was arrested, that was great. And then his arrogance was to the point where he thought he was going to get away with it. When we sat him down and we Mirandized him, he looked at the ATF agent and myself and he looked at straight face, went, you read those rights to me wrong. We've done this before. He claimed that we framed him. We lost evidence. You name it. He called all of us buffoons. And it went on and on and on until recently. But it was one of those cases that I worked on nonstop while I was doing other cases as a solo detective from my office. And it just made me realize how encompassing a case can be and how crazy a case could be, which doesn't even include his act of arson was a violent crime, but it wasn't, he didn't aim for it to kill people. He aimed to destroy evidence. But how quickly a case that could go from a paper pusher case to a violent case. So no, it was one that A&E channel made a TV show about. Somebody wrote a book about it. You had numerous articles across the country, and it was just a very intense case that I ran with from 6 months into being a detective to right before my retirement, which we officially closed the case. And we finally were able to say, because once he was released from federal prison due to his health, we probably were not going to prosecute him on the county level and the state level. And then him dying kind of precluded that. But he was a person who didn't care about anybody else, including himself. He was willing to do whatever it took to make money. He lived by greed, and he didn't care about hurting others if it was going to cover up the evidence of his crime. So he took the chance of almost killing multiple people to try to get away from a paper crime.
And at the end of the day, it took great detective work to bring him down and not only untangle that lie, but as you laid out, a series of lies, and well done. Were you aiming for it to be a career case? No. And that's usually when they become career cases. Joe Torre used to say to his Yankee players all the time, think small and big things will happen. You thought small, you took it on as a normal case. It became something that, like I said, was the magnum opus moment in your police career and the catapult for greater things. So moving up in the ranks, going to lieutenant, to sergeant, as you laid out earlier, then lieutenant, then captain. Tell me about the positive fallout from it, where in addition to dealing with it as you did on the side in other cases too, now you're bumping up. Now you're in greater positions. You have greater responsibility. So it's a lot to juggle, but you seem like you enjoy juggling it.
Oh, I did. That case showed people that I was capable of handling complex issues and dealing with big cases and being able to compartmentalize. So I took that, and as I learned, that allowed me to hit the streets and be able to advise the officers later on when I was a sergeant that, hey, you know what? Let's run this case ourselves. Let's deal with this. Let's work it ourselves. We'll call detectives as necessary, but let me kind of help you moving in the right direction. It taught me to really think outside of the box, which was huge later on when I started taking on projects as a sergeant, such as emergency management for my city. Learning about emergency operations, EOC activations, natural disaster responses, how to deal with FEMA, how to deal with outside agencies, rolling into then taking charge of our boat patrol unit to deal with a large waterfront presence of not only numerous yacht harbors containing boats that cost everywhere from $1,000 to $3 million, but right outside those rich harbors, you have what was referred to as anchor outs, and still are the few that remain, that imagine a Skid Row on water. And you have the equivalent of homeless living in derelict vessels across our portion of the San Francisco Bay, in which it's known that there are active thefts occurring throughout the waterfront. There was narcotics, there were sexual assaults, and taking on that and dealing with that issue and trying to help enforce that and reduce the crime and enhance the quality of life on the waterfront. That allowed me to open up so many things as a sergeant and learn about different types of policing and different styles of policing, that when I moved in later into lieutenant and captain, I was given larger projects that had a police and a city connectivity, which were just, it's not just police work, but now we're talking about city management work. It allowed me to actually be able to handle those a lot easier than it would have been if I would have just stayed in my lane of patrol and just focused on, just had the basic patrol experience.
And when you deal with something so complex, as you just laid out perfectly, and you handle it with aplomb and you rely on outside resources as you need to, and you collaborate and prove that you can play well in the sandbox with others, which is another critical component of policing, both with those in your own agency and those from outside agencies. In this case, it was the ATF. Anything else is a piece of cake. Will there be difficult cases? Yeah, but if you can handle that, it's kind of like guys that were in the army and then joined the police department, as you were talking about earlier. If you could handle seeing combat in World War One, World War Two, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, you could handle patrol beat. A sector car is a walk in the park. So there is that's another positive effect of a magnum opus or career moment, if you will, in a lengthy police career as yours was. Everything else becomes easier because you're able to have that necessary tunnel vision. Okay, here's what I had in this case. Here's what went well. Here's what we did that helped matters. Or even here's what we did that maybe if I could have a mulligan on that one, I would have done this instead. Not only can you guide yourself, but you can guide the detectives working under you, especially the newer ones.
Exactly. And when I was assigned to help guide the detectives, we dealt with prostitution. We had a homicide. We had sexual assaults. We had all these different crimes that usually don't occur in quick succession in my city because of our small size. We see everything that everybody else sees. We just see a much lower number, but we don't see them back to back to back to back. So it was able to allow me to impart the wisdom of, you know what, we all can't do it ourselves. We have to reach out for help. Let's talk. Let's contact San Francisco PD. Let's reach out to the FBI. Let's call our sheriff's office. Let's contact the Coast Guard to help us out on the water. You learn to build teams. I remember being in a meeting many years ago regarding waterfront law enforcement. And we were at the Coast Guard base in Alameda. And the two-star admiral walks in. And he says, I love seeing this meeting. I love seeing everybody talking here. He goes, let me give you a piece of advice. And he tells the crowd, and we have officers there, sergeants, and we have people going up the rank of captain in different organizations. And he goes, I learned a long time ago that the only thing I could do by myself is get myself in trouble. In order to succeed, you have to work as a team. And I heard that, and I said, you know what? That means a lot. And I tried to funnel that into my style for the years to come. It was, hey, if we need help, if we're looking at a gang thing, let's call San Francisco PD's gang task force. They know how to run this. Hey, if we're dealing with financial issues, okay, let's contact the IRS. What we're dealing with a counterfeiter, let's call Secret Service. Let's not be afraid to make calls. And a lot of times in small agencies, people are afraid to think outside the box, or, you know what, if I call this larger agency, they're just going to ignore me. Well, no, they're not. I found out when I was at the National Academy, big city cops are shocked at the type of police work we do in small cities when they find out, hey, yeah, you know what? I was the beat officer. I caught a sexual assault. I ran with that the entire time. They're going, whoa, you didn't hand it off? No, I did the evidence processing. I did the interview. I did the interrogation later. I ran the case up to the DAs. We did everything. And they're going, man, I can't even imagine doing that from beginning to the end. Well, small cities have to. And being able to build teams and educate people to think outside of the box helped me be able to kind of transport what little knowledge I had to the next generation of officers.
Right. And that's the thing that, makes you really appreciate what small departments do, because movies and TV haven't helped. You think of the small town department and the cop sitting in his patrol car passed out, and the radio goes off and wakes him up, and listen, I'm not saying that doesn't go on in certain parts of the country or world, but most small police departments that are operating with less, they're doing more. They're your workhorses because they're wearing, as you said, 4 or 5 different hats at one. One, they're a beat cop. Then they're the sergeant. Then they're the detective, sometimes all on the same call, which, you look at a big city agency. I'm not knocking bigger city agencies. It's good to use those resources if you have it. They have enough resources to be able to say, all right, listen, the detective bureau's got it. And they can just move on from call to call. And that's what works for them. But I think it's in these other classes and discussions that you have, or just encounters at conferences with other officers, that you realize it's the same job, but the responsibilities and how they're delegated are dramatically different. And sometimes your smaller city cop is probably a bit more well-rounded than your big city cop.
Exactly. The big city cops have been to the cause 1,000 times, and they're spectacular at their part of the job. But it's hard to transition them out of that because, well, they have so many other responsibilities, but there's also so many specialists behind them to handle so many other the incident after them. Well, the small town cop, and let's put it in perspective, over 86% of law enforcement agencies in the United States are under 50. about 74% of them are actually under 25. So that the majority of cops in the US are small city cops. And these are the people out there that have to know how to do all part of it. And if it really gets specialized, then you call for the people that are the true specialists to help. What happens is you think of yes, cops will fall asleep in a small city in the patrol car. They will bumble a case. Everybody will bumble a case. And people, well, it's because they're lesser cops because they're from a small department. No, truly, we're not lesser cops. We might not have seen the 30 murders, but the 2 murders, I handled them. And that's where you're going, oh, you know what? It wasn't just show up and throw up crime scene tape. It's like, do all these little things. But we both learn so much from each other. You want to learn how to handle a major event. You want to learn how to handle a major disaster. You look at the big city cops and they do spectacular jobs, and you take those lessons and you move it on. You're looking at implementing community or neighborhood policing. Well, you look at smaller agencies because that's how we've been policing since the creation of our agencies. This is how you develop relationships within your neighborhoods. This is how you develop partnerships with the public. So we should be learning from each other, but too often you have big city people that may sometimes think small agencies don't have anything to offer them. And you have small agencies, their officers thinking, well, that's only a big city thing. I don't have to think that way. Or what they're doing, I'm never going to deal with. Well, no, we're all going to deal with it. We're just going to deal with it in different manners.
Right. And that brings me to class 269 or session 269 of the FBI National Academy, because that is the ultimate, no, you do have to think this way. This is something that could affect your job at some point. Just because it hasn't happened to this point doesn't mean it can't moment. And it's really an eye-opener, even for the most experienced of officers. So tell me about, well, this is a two-pronged question. One, the opportunity to even be in the class. And 2, for those unfamiliar with it, what does the FBI National Academy consist of?
The FBI National Academy is basically a graduate school for command level officers. Only about 1% of law enforcement officers are able to get in. They only accept about 250 students every quarter from across the world. And in most cases, you have to be a lieutenant or above to go to the academy. And this is where you learn advanced law enforcement procedures, skills, theories, and you're picking the brains of not only the instructors that are highly accomplished and highly skilled FBI senior agents, but you're also picking the minds of your fellow students and sometimes learning more from your students than you are from the instructors. I got lucky. I applied for it in 2016, shortly after I made lieutenant, and I was able to attend the class in 2017. Some people wait 6, 7, 8 years to get in. I waited a little bit over a year. When I went there, it helped solidify a lot of the theories I had about how we must cooperate with each other. We must work with each other. We must coordinate with each other. Big cities and small cities need to be on the same page, need to have connections with each other. We have to be willing to lift up a phone and make a phone call. Even after I got out of the academy, I had connections in which we had something going on in Colorado. I knew somebody in Colorado. Let me make a phone call. Or, hey, you know what? Who do I need to contact? My case follow-up is in New York. I don't know anybody in New York. Give me a second. Let me make a phone call. Let me see if I could find somebody for you. But also, it exposes you to people that, while everybody there has on average about 17 to 20 years of law enforcement, some less, some more, everybody has so many different perspectives and so many different types of experience. We had individuals that were at ground zero. We had people that investigated major cases like the John Benet Ramsey case. We had people that the Pulse nightclub shooting. We had individuals from Alaska that, as part of their duties, was they needed to know how to fly an airplane to get to a portion of their beat. So we had so many different talents and uniqueness. And then when you bring the foreign students in, and you're talking to somebody who's in the Mongolian intelligence agency, and they're telling you how they do things. I was very lucky. I had my roommate, and you just get assigned roommates randomly. You had to live with whoever your roommate is. They don't let you trade. My roommate was spectacular, and he was an officer from Montenegro. And he was telling me how he was investigating corruption in their government. And prior to coming to the National Academy, he had just arrested the vice president for corruption. So I was like, okay, let's talk about this. How do you do this? So it's basically like, I like to say it's West Point for police, and it prepares you to be a bigger mindset and it prepares you for the larger command responsibilities that you will encounter as you move your way up into the captains and chiefs positions.
I like how you put that, West Point, because it is indeed, a place where not only you can learn valuable tactics from your instructors, but naturally, as you said, you network. Because here's the thing, and here's the hard reality of police work and what police are up against in terms of the criminal element. The criminal element, for the most part, has no problem networking. They don't have any problem maintaining communications and cutting down whatever perceived red tape to get whatever dirty objective they want done on the street or above. Why shouldn't police have the same remedies to counteract that? And that's where something like the FBI National Academy comes into play. And look at the idea that it's sprouted and it segues into Code 33 Consulting, which you started with Steve Espinoza,
Yes.
someone from an entirely different background. There you are in Sausalito, California, and here he is, a captain in the New York City Police Department in the Emergency Service Unit, the most elite police unit, or one of the most elite police units in the world, not just the country, but the world. So something like that, look at the benefits. Talking about the networking, not only did you two network in that specific instance, you're helping other cops, not just in your respective areas, across the country, across the world.
Yeah, and that's one of the great things that brought a bunch of people with a similar mindset, but which function in different ways, and allowed us to have so many different contacts. While I had met a million NYPD cops during working cases and making phone calls or bumping into cops on vacation, I never got to know the NYPD officers like I did those that were at the National Academy. And Stephen was perfect example. Me and him, very different backgrounds, East Coast, West Coast, but a lot of the same philosophies, had a lot of the same thought processes. So when we both ended up in retirement and I was starting up Code 33, I said, hey, you know what? I would love to bring somebody with your amazing skill set, amazing knowledge, and thought process into this, not only to add your pedigree to this, but also somebody who I trust 1,000,000% to be able to say, I'm working on this. I need another set of eyes to tell me where am I wrong. And you have that. But it's like, I was talking to a buddy of mine today who's in Colorado now. He retired to Colorado, and they're looking to talk for somebody to help their National Academy out, their associates group out with a training thing. And he asked, hey, are you able to possibly help? More than happy to help. Connections that help us keep on moving forward. And it is, if we're not learning from each other, if we're not paying attention to what each other are doing, if we're not helping each other, we're being a detriment. And part of going to the National Academy is giving something back to the profession and to the officers within that profession.
And again, that's the key to look at it. The career gives you so much. Are there pressures and frustrations? Yes, but the job gives you so much. It's a duty to give it back if you can, in any way you can. And that's what you did at the Academy, and that's what you're doing with Code 33 Consulting and the book, too, which I wanted to highlight as well and didn't want to let this podcast pass by without asking you about. Leadership in Law Enforcement, 10 Key Traits is the title. And I imagine the process to write it, did that start before or after the Academy?
It started before. I had actually completed it before. I didn't publish it until after the Academy. It started with my thesis for my master's degree. And I was always a big student of leadership. And I found as I was studying leadership, there wasn't much good police leadership books. There were a lot of books that told me what span of control was, or how many people are on a squad and how do you approve a report. But there wasn't anything regarding the concepts and the theories of leadership. So I turned, like a lot of people did, to the study of military leadership, because military leadership has been ingrained in society through the military educations, through the military leaders that went to become presidents of banks, become CEOs, as well as the heads of our United States, the president of the United States in many cases. So I started studying them, and I ran across several books written by Edward Pruer, who was an author and military historian, and he focused on leadership traits of 3-star and 4-star generals, as well as 3-star and 4-star admirals amongst all the branches. And he created these books. And I'm reading them one day as I'm getting ready to think, what am I going to do for my thesis? And I'm going, you know what? We need something that's strictly on the study of leadership and the best traits of leaders in law enforcement. And I said, I'm going to focus on that. And as I was working on it, I sent out letters to numerous police chiefs, commissioners, and sheriffs across the United States. And I got lucky, and I got 13 people from agencies as large as New York PD to as small as Tiburon, California, which is stone's throw away from me. And it was small. It was a 13-person department. Mm. And it was from as far north as Minnesota and as far south as Miami. But some of the big names I landed to be able to pick their brains was William Bratton, Charles Ramsey, John Timoney, and as well as Douglas Gillespie out of Las Vegas Metro, and many people from across the country. And be able to pick their minds on, I said, through my study of leadership, I feel that leadership is broken down to 10 core traits that you have to have in order to be a successful leader. And it doesn't mean you have to have all of them at all times, but you need to have these traits. You have to have the ability to be a selfless leader. You have to believe in mentorship. You have to be able to make decisions. You have to have to strive for education, both formal and informal. You have to be able to accept change and embrace change. You have to be able to tell the hard truths at times. You have to have a presence. You have to be able to communicate. You have to build teams. And you have to be able to seek consensus at times and guide. So I took those traits and I asked what their opinions were of them. I took those and I incorporated what I learned from other different studies and different readings. As you can see in my back of me, I have numerous books and I have a huge police library. And then I had the times of interviewing some of them and picking their minds and putting together this book that I originally published in 2018 as a lieutenant. But since I was active duty, I couldn't really push it out and do much more than just publish it. And I just republished it a few months ago. And I was lucky enough to get some key endorsements from General David Petraeus, from Medal of Honor recipient Sammy Davis from the Vietnam War, from police leaders, as well as Chief Stephen Sund, who dealt with the January 6th craziness, and people from up and down, as well as fire chiefs and FBI agents and other police chiefs and Army Rangers and Navy admirals. Even the executive director of PERF, the Police Executive Research Forum, endorsed it when I originally published it. So it got me thinking that I'm on the right mindset. So I published that to be able to help the profession and to allow leadership to continue to grow and try to help it as much as possible, because in law enforcement, there are few things that we do that are great. There are things that we do that are great, but leading sometimes is not one of them. We kind of sometimes select leaders by accident, not by choice. In mentorship and training and education, we fall behind on. And we have to really focus on that to prepare the next generation of police leaders by preparing them, guiding them, directing them, helping them, educating them, and being available. And that means we have to take a little bit of us and give it to them and continue to move forward, because we lose so much institutional knowledge every single time one of us retires and don't pass on our lessons. And I took those lessons from all these leaders, and then I incorporated things from my career, and not my successes and not my triumphs, because I've learned more from my failures and my missteps than I ever learned from my successes. So I want people to learn from my mistakes. But also I incorporated lessons I learned from horrible leaders and poor leaders, because when you have a leader that can't and they're a chief of police and they can't make a decision, and that impacts everybody, or they treat people unfairly or unbiasedly, or and they're not consistent. That is problematic. Or they never show up at calls, or the only way you know they're a cop is because when they take off their jacket, you see a little bit of a badge. They are not proud to wear the uniform. Those are all things that we have to incorporate and continue to improve on, and show that we're a profession. We're trying to make things better for us all and be better. And also that we're proud of our profession, and that the uniform we wear and the star or the badge we wear on our chest and the patches on our shoulders are indicators of our pride in the department we work for and the profession we represent.
I don't even think I need to ask you about when you knew it was time to retire, because you retired in name only. You put the paperwork in 2023, but you're still so active in teaching that the question isn't even warranted. And that's, again, as I've said numerous times throughout this interview, perfectly said. Because, and especially now, you're seeing certain generations of those in the emergency response field, they're beginning to pass away. They're beginning to leave us much too soon. Or, especially for those in the New York City area, leaders of the fire department, leaders of the police department that were down at ground zero are getting sick and are dying way too young. So it's important to get those lessons passed on, because if the current generation isn't learning it, then again, they're going to learn as they go anyway. The field teaches you something new every day. You're going to see things you never thought you'd see before. But that education, in addition to what the prior generation is telling you, is critical not just for the here and now, but those that may become cops in the future. What's it going to look like 15, 20 years from now if those lessons aren't being taught? And you jog something in my brain, and I see it where I work, because it applies to the fire side too. A great resume does not make a great and qualified leader. I'm lucky. I got great leaders, and I'm not just saying that because I work there. I see it in action. Our captains, our lieutenants, our chiefs, they're the kind of guys you'd want to run through 2 brick walls for, let alone 1. You don't see that everywhere else. So when I see how certain police agencies are run, when I see how certain fire departments are run elsewhere, it makes me so proud and so lucky, Bill, to realize I don't have that problem. But there's so many agencies that can't say the same thing, and it's for exactly what you just said.
Exactly. In law enforcement and even on the fire service, we're so consumed by the crisis of the moment that we don't take the time to think back and learn from the events of our history. We don't take the times to look back and go, okay, have we dealt with this before? What did we do? What lessons did we learn? What could we implement? We forget our leaders the second they walk out the door.
Mhm.
And that's for the good and the bad. If I were to go up to the average New York police officer today and say, who's Louis Valentine? They would have the biggest glare on. I don't know. Well, he is the commissioner who served second longest to Ray Kelly. Ray Kelly was the longest serving ever. Valentine was the second longest, but he was also during a time of rebuilding the department and bringing back integrity and revamping it and becoming it a very huge professional law enforcement agency that he was so good. Douglas MacArthur picked him to reestablish the police departments in Japan after World War II. So it's like, but if you go to a West Point cadet and go, hey, who's Dwight Eisenhower? Well, Dwight Eisenhower is this. They know their history. They know what has happened before. They learn from it. Sometimes they make the same mistakes, but guess what? They have a game plan. We don't do that in law enforcement. And if we're not learning from our great leaders as well as much from our bad leaders, I mean, I've worked with chiefs, like I would run through that brick wall. I would do anything they told me. I've also worked for a chief who, to this day, I probably, if they walked by me, I wouldn't acknowledge them, because later on, after they had left the department and I had remained and I saw them at a conference and I actually walked up to them and said, hi, chief, ignored me and just walked the other way. And it was like, okay, well, you know what? Me and you never got along, but I was never disrespectful for you. So you're going to do that. And that's how they treated their employees. So you learn from the bad, you learn from the best, but you keep on pushing it. And retirement, I mean, we talked about this not online, but offline, but retirement wasn't really my choice. I suffered an injury back in 2002, conducting a rescue from a person who's trapped in a vehicle. And I suffered a back injury that just over time got worse and worse and worse. And me being a young, stubborn cop, just thought I could grit and bear the pain. And as I got older, my back started saying you can't. And then it got to the point where I was physically incapable of doing the job anymore. And that was a hard call to make because I had promoted to command. I was the acting chief of police when it happened, when I finally made the call that says I have to go out and get some treatment and try to get better. And then having the doctor say, you're never getting better. It's just, we have to manage and try to make things less painful now. And you can't do the job anymore. For somebody who's lived and breathed police work basically his entire life, that was hard. But I had great mentors. I had great leaders. I had great friends that are willing to help. And not just my family. I mean, my dad still, him and I talk about policing every day, different aspects. He's been out of the job for 29 years, but he's still aware of everything that's going on. But me and Chief Stephen's son are texting each other, talking about events that are occurring across the nation. I have emails with military and police leaders, and we're discussing things about what's going on, and we share leadership theories. Things like that. Those people not only encouraged me early in my career to be a better cop and to keep on moving up the ranks, they've encouraged me to take the next step and continue to push forward to help the profession, to help the officers. I love police departments. I want to help make them the best possible. And that's what I'm here for. And I love officers, and I want to be there to assist them any way I can, anyhow I can. Whoever wants to listen and thinks I'm worth anything. But the job, I remember when I was talking to my chief, retired about the same time as I did. We both had medical issues that drove us out of the profession earlier than we both wanted to be. And I remember me and him talking, and I said, well, you know what? I said, I see somebody do something stupid on the roadway and I think it's dangerous. I still reach down to try to turn on the sirens to stop the car. And I'm going, my SUV or my Corvette doesn't have that siren anymore. So I'm going, or I see something going on and I'm going, somebody needs to contact that person. And I go, well, no, the cops are en route already. I'm no longer in the blue uniform, but I still want to do that. So it shows that while I may not be an active cop anymore, I'm still a cop at heart, and I want to help cops out.
And you do. And you certainly do. And that segues perfectly into the rapid fire, which, as you know, it's the 5 hit run questions. So I might add a 6 because Joe Maliga in the chat, he's got the running joke, which I haven't gotten to yet because we haven't had the time to, but I want to. So we'll actually start off with his before I get to the other ones. And the question, did you ever deliver a baby?
No, never had to deliver a baby. Was 2 seconds the kid was delivered about 2 seconds before I walked in the room.
All right. Well, it made the job. Yeah, it made the call a little bit easier. So there you go, Joe. I didn't forget about you, buddy. Now to the other rapid fires. Funniest call you ever responded to?
I was an acting sergeant at the time. I was supervising a patrol team that both officers had less than a year and a half on. It was pouring down rain in the middle of February. It was cold as anything. And I turned onto the roadway, and right in the middle of the northbound lane is a vehicle abandoned, doors wide open, and a bunch of clothing all over the car. And I call it out as a suspicious vehicle. I get out of the car and I'm looking at it. I'm going, that's a bra that's hanging on the antenna. There's underwear here. There's jeans here. And I hear noise coming to my right. And I look over and there's 2 girls that are probably in their mid-20s, buck naked, getting ready in the middle of a rainstorm, getting ready to dive into the San Francisco Bay, which is about 40 degrees at the time. And I key up on the radio, okay, I'll be out with skinny dippers. And the dispatcher, who is a dear friend of mine, comes on the radio and just says, you're kidding me. And nope. I talk them off the steep rocks they're on, and I get there and I see emergency lights in the background. And my 2 brand new young officers want to see these 2 naked girls so bad. They're running code 3 to try to get to me. And then as I'm looking forward, I see more lights coming from our allied sheriff's office trying to get over here to take a look at the girls as well. So I shut them down. And after a while, I convinced them, hey, you know what? Let's get clothed. Don't jump into the pay, get hypothermia. And I'm sitting there, and the officers I had was a male officer and a female officer. and we're all chuckling. And then an argument breaks out between the two skinny dippers and the female officer. And the skinny dippers just make a comment to her, well, nobody wants to see you naked anyway. And we just lose it at that moment. We laugh unbelievably. And I tell him, get dressed, get out of there. But yeah, no, that just the comedy of that entire situation, it just makes me laugh to this day.
I can see that. And we go from that. And I always wonder, why do I put these two questions together? Because there's such a contrast, but that's what makes it funny. And it adds to the humor of the segment. And that is most uplifting call.
Oh God, it's so hard to say. I would say it goes back to, I had been doing disaster management and emergency management work for a long time. I've been dealing with community groups. And I had a very well-known couple in our city come down to see me once. I was the graveyard sergeant. I was working weekend night shift. And I was the second senior sergeant at the time. So I purposely put myself on that shift because me and the then chief weren't just jiving and I didn't want to be around them. So I put myself on Siberia shift, and this couple who I'd got to know, and we were able to talk and we've developed trust, give me a call on a Sunday at about 10 p.m. saying, hey, could we come down and talk to you? Yeah, come on down. So they come down, and it has nothing to do with police work. It has nothing to do with emergency management or community preparedness or anything. They were having trouble with their granddaughter, and she was going on the wild side and she needed help, and they didn't know what to do or how to do it because they were elderly and they needed somebody to talk to and somebody to give them some advice. And they said they thought of me and they wanted to talk to me. And I gave them what information I had and what thought processes I had and what I thought could be helpful. And a week later, I got a beautiful little handwritten thank you note from the grandmother saying, Bill, thank you so much. It's helping us deal with our granddaughter, and your counsel was so needed, and we appreciate you so much, and thank you for being there. That was the most uplifting because it wasn't one of the lives I saved. It wasn't any of that stuff, but it was something where I know I made an impact on a family and I helped a family, and I did something for a wonderful elderly couple that I had known for years and had done so much for the community. I was there to help.
Help you did. Third, this is something we've talked about a bit throughout the program in relation to how you've given it to others, but early on in the job, best advice you would say you've gotten.
I already talked about the best advice I ever got from my chief was that it's no longer about you. It's about what you could do for others. The second best piece of advice I got from one of my sergeants, who was one of those horrible leaders that I never wanted to be like, but I learned so much from.
Yeah.
And the best thing he ever said to me that I still remember to the day was, life is not a tragedy and every call is not an emergency, which I took, and I learned that this is time where you slow things down. You don't rush into situations. You look at the global perspective, and you calm yourself down and you deal with it, and you adjust and you adapt as necessary. But the world's not going to end, and you don't have to act like it's going to end, and you don't have to run around all crazy. Calm things down, slow things down, deal with the matter at hand. And that, as I progressed and I got higher in the ranks, and I remembered that all the time, because when you're sitting there as a sergeant, they tell you, hey, look at this IA, or you later on when you go upstairs and they say, hey, you have these people behaving this way or doing this. Your first reaction is, oh, you know what, we're going to smack this person, or what, these people are idiot. Why are they doing this? And then it's like, well, no, slow down for a second. Let's see what's really happening here.
Yeah, well said. The last question, the rapid fire, I won't ask because we've talked about advice to younger officers tonight as well, so it's kind of redundant if I do. So with Joe's question combined with these three, this is actually the fifth and final one, if you will, and that is favorite cop show or cop movie.
Two favorite cop shows, actually three, all combined. I can't. So one, Hill Street Blues, just amazing show. Showed first real cop show. Next was Crime Story. Crime Story is about Chicago PD. It was supposed to be back in the 50s and 60s. it ran for a few years in the 80s. If it was on TV today, it would be a hit. Dennis Farina, retired Chicago PD detective, was the star on that show. Hardcore stud cops. You can't get any better. And the last one is, if you want to see how cops interact and a cop's humor, Barney Miller.
Yeah.
That's, if you want to see how cops talk to each other and just the banter in the squad room, especially an investigative unit, you can't get any better than that.
Nah, it's funny because Dennis Farina, when I think of him, he's not with us anymore. He's another one that he died way too young, about 11 years ago now. Joe Fontana, he was Detective Joe Fontana on Law and Order, and he didn't have an easy role, but he wasn't on the show long, but he made a positive impact because he was replacing Jerry Orbach as Detective Lenny Briscoe. And Lenny Briscoe, of course, the most iconic detective in the history of that franchise, my personal favorite, that when I watched her reruns in hindsight's 2020, like, man, for having only been on the show 2 years and having to replace such an iconic character, Dennis Farina, in a testament to his acting ability, did a fine job of it. So great actor, and he's not forgotten.
He brought that detective swagger into every role he played. And when he never stopped being Chicago PD at heart.
No, never. And he was in the robbery squad, I believe. Homicide, I think he was in as well. He had a full 18-year career from 67 to 85.
Yeah, he was something special.
He was. And Barney Miller, same thing. I've heard that a lot. That's a most accurate portrayal of a detective squad that you could find. Bill, this has been great. Stick around. We'll talk off air. Before I say goodbye to the audience, you have the book. Of course, you have Code 33 Consulting, which I'll link in the description of this episode, or I already have, actually, but I have to link the book as well because I haven't yet. Anything else that you want to shout out, or anyone that you want to shout out?
Oh, so many people. You know what? It's the chiefs of police that always guided me. Scott Paulin, who was the one that promoted me. My father, who guided me through all these years. There's just too many people. And to this present day, Chief Sund, General Petraeus, those people that still guide me and help me. Thank them all. But the most important thing, it goes back to how you started this episode, not today. That's important. We have to remember, we've all known people and we've all lost people in police, fire, military service, to suicide. We have to be here to help each other, and we have to be here to take care of each other and be there for each other in the good times and the bad times. And sometimes it's just that person that is willing to listen that could help somebody up through a hard time. So we always have to remember that. And it segues to the job is the best job there is in the world. There's nothing better. It doesn't matter what coast you're on, if you're north or south, or even what country you're in. A cop is a cop, and we're here for each other. And for all those guys that are still, and girls that are still putting on the uniforms every day, putting the badge on, putting the badge and taking the gun on the hip and going out and meeting the danger and dealing with the craziness, I can never say thank you enough. And if you ever need anything, give me a holler. I would help whatever way I can.
Same is true for me, even as a civilian. Reach out, whatever I can do to support the mission. By all means, I'm here to do so as well. Like I said, this has been great. Stick around. We'll talk off air. Coming up next on the Mike the New Haven podcast, a couple of fire guests before we push into June. And that is going to be Ron Canterman, fire prevention inspector currently with the FDNY. Long history of the fire service between Jersey, my home state of Connecticut. Really implemented a lot of the training measures you see at the FDNY's Academy now. And he'll talk to me about that. That started up about early 90s or so. Next week, hometown guy for me, New Haven, Connecticut guy, Fire Chief Frank Ritchie for the Best of the Bravest nationwide. This Friday's the Best of the Bravest interviews with the FDNY's Elite Volume 61. And just a reminder for those of you that will be tuning in going forward, it's starting in June, moving the show from Wednesdays and Fridays to Mondays and Fridays, a little bit of a schedule change. It'll be 6 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Pacific going forward. So we'll keep the Friday format. That's not changing, but the show's going to move from Wednesdays to Fridays. That way I can complement a couple things I got going on in my life right now. Once again, as always, as Bill said, and I mentioned at the top of the show, not today. And a big shout out once again to Derek Torres. Congrats on graduating Fire Academy, my brother. And once again, a big ups to my man, Pete Landis. Best in your new chapter in the Norwalk Fire Department. In the meantime, this has been Volume 13 of The Beat, Profiles of Police Nationwide. And on behalf of Captain Bill Fraass, I'm Mike Colón. We will see you next time. Go Rangers. And for those of you tuning in to the outro song on the audio side, Spotify and Apple and anywhere else that you get the audio podcast, we're going to take you back to the summer of 2000. I was blasting this song earlier. It's a great song for the summertime. Third Eye Blind. never let you go. So enjoy it. One of my favorites, if you're listening on the audio. Like I said, it's been volume 13 of The Beat. And on behalf of Captain Bill Fraass, I am Mike Colón, and we'll see you next time. Take care. Have a good night. Once again, go Rangers.
Thank you.